Hello and welcome to our Revealed Reality Bible Study series on the Gospel of John. I am Reverend Art B. Carter Jr. and I will serve as your host and facilitator for this study. Before we begin, I need you to go over to my website at www.WT as in Tom, FO.biz, B-I-Z. Again, that's www.WTFO.biz. Click on the Revealed Reality Bible Study link on the bottom left-hand corner of the homepage, and it will lead you to the page where you can access the resources for this study. The resources for this study include a PDF file, which you can view online, or you can download it, or you can print it off directly. It is the study guide for each session. You may also, on that same resource page, access the video files that accompany each session. Again, I thank you for joining us. I'm Reverend Art B. Carter Jr. We're studying the Gospel of John. Today's session is part 2 of our study. And in this study, we will be reviewing highlights and comparisons between the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke and the Gospel of John. Let's get started. Let's take a quick review of part 1 of our series. In part 1 of our series, we were encouraged to take off the lenses. What lenses are we talking about? Take off the lenses of the ruling of Nicaea, in which the fathers of the church affirmed the two natures of Jesus Christ, as well as some of our other traditional Christian doctrines that have been handed down to us. We want to take off those lenses because those would have not been the same lenses through which John would have viewed the things about Jesus, as well as his own writing. So we want to take off the lenses from the rulings of Nicaea, and then 100 years later, the rulings from the Council of Chalcedon. And then we want to take off the lenses of our modern day interpretation. I'm not saying that you should not interpret this writing as the Spirit leads you. I'm just suggesting that we already come to the table with preconceived notions regarding what the text is saying. These preconceived notions are based upon the things that we have already read or already heard have been taught to us. We want to take off those lenses, and instead, we want to put on some different lenses. What lenses are those? We want to put on John's lenses, the lens through which John would have viewed Jesus and his own writing. We want to also put on the lenses of John's audience. How did they see this writing? How did they receive it? How did they understand it and internalize it? And then finally, we want to put on the lenses of the text itself. A couple of important goals. We want to bridge the gap between what we've heard and what John is actually saying. And we also want to bridge the gap between what we think the text is saying and what we actually read it to say. So let's continue with our review. In last week's lesson, or in part 1, we explored the question, what are the Gospels? Well, we know that the Gospels are the first 4 books of the New Testament, and they are stories written about the life and ministry of Jesus. We also noted that each Gospel originates from a different community of believers. Each of these communities have different perspectives, and therefore the stories that each gospel presents are slightly different. Even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke may list some of the same stories, we will see that how they outline the details of some of the same stories that they share, how they outline the details are very different. Why? Because each community is voicing its beliefs and claims about Jesus. We also explored the question in part 1 as to who wrote the Gospel of John. Well, the question of authorship ultimately remains unanswered because we cannot ultimately know exactly who wrote it, but many, if not most, believe it was written by the disciple John, the very same one who was the beloved disciple and who walked and talked and ministered with Jesus. And some actually believe it was a different John. Me, myself, and I believe that the author was probably a Palestinian Jew who definitely had a first-hand knowledge of Jerusalem and the surrounding country. But it really doesn't matter who the author is per se. It doesn't affect my faith because my faith is not in the author. My faith is in the writing that has been handed down to us. We also took a look at the question in part 1 of when. When was it written? Well, most conservative scholars date this gospel to around AD 85 to 95 or CE, which means Common Era, year 85 to 95. So if that be the case, then that means this writing was probably read and attested to by people who were one generation removed from Jesus, which means that some of John's original audience could have actually been people that knew Jesus or had heard about him during his lifetime. Who knows? Possibly even people who had been blessed by him during his earthly ministry. We explored just a little bit of the question in part 1 as to where was it written. Well, tradition says John wrote from the city of Ephesus, where he moved after the Jewish war with Rome. Let's talk a little bit about Ephesus and why this connection is possibly so strong. Well, we know that Ephesus was a large cosmopolitan center of the ancient world where the cultures of East and West mingled. So it would be considered like a New York City, a Los Angeles, California, major metropolitan areas where as New York and Los Angeles have millions of people. We certainly know that Ephesus would have had thousands, if not 10,000s of people. It was a major metropolitan area. We also know that the Apostle Paul had previously founded an active church in Ephesus, and that's found in Acts chapter 19. And he spent over 2 years there, during which time he actually evangelized most of the province of Asia Minor. Now that's something, isn't it? We can't hardly evangelize the people on our block. And here he evangelized the entire province, geographical area of Asia Minor. Now, it's interesting to note that when John was in exile on the Isle of Patmos and received the revelation, he wrote, if you remember, to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and the first church on the list to whom he wrote was Ephesus. So that gives us some strong indication that it's very plausible that John was writing from the city of Ephesus. Let's take another look at why was this gospel written. We know that mass upheaval and confusion in most Palestinian Jewish communities existed following Rome's war against the Jewish people in the late 60s. This war, as we said before, culminated in the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That happened around the year 70 of the Common Era. As a result, there was the death of an estimated 1 million Jews following and during the war. The expulsion of Jews from the city of Jerusalem and surrounding areas took place. And also there was a mass migration of Jews to other areas of the Roman Empire in the aftermath of the war. Well, you may ask, so what? Why are you even saying this? Well, it's this background that sets the tone of the writing that John has handed down to us. Why? Because chaos and upheaval resulted from the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The Jerusalem temple where the Jews went to encounter God, receive atonement for their sins, and to interact with other spiritual and social matters. And so we know that the destruction of the temple resulted in major spiritual crisis, because the bottom line to the Jewish people was, if there's no temple, where will we go to encounter God? And where will we go to make sacrifices to God? And where and how will we ever receive atonement for our sins? Well, as we said in part 1, John's answer to all this question is Jesus. People will now encounter God in and through Jesus. People will now receive healing through Jesus. And similar to the prophet Moses, God will provide people's daily bread through Jesus. Jesus reveals the will of God. Jesus is God's sacrifice for humankind, and Jesus' sacrifice atoned for our sins. Now, we know the Gospel of John, right? Because many of its tenets and its points are a strong part of the Christian tradition that has been handed down to us. It's also worthy to note that some of John's gospel is actually in sync with the teachings of the Apostle Paul. And since the Apostle Paul's teachings predate the Gospels, we have to assume that John is borrowing from the concepts and the writings of the Apostle Paul. That's why some of the concepts in both of their writings are so similar. We also know that Paul's gospel, as I said, is the gospel most modern day Christians know and embraced. Let's talk a little bit about John's audience, and then we'll take a break. The intended recipients of John's gospel are not clearly identified, but based upon the writer's habit of explaining Jewish usages, translating Jewish names, and locating Palestinian sites, it would appear that he was probably writing to and for a predominantly non-Jewish Christian audience outside of Palestine. Again, if he were talking to mostly Jewish people, he would not have the need to explain some of the Jewish terms, names, places, and customs as he does. But since he probably was writing to mostly non-Jewish people, there was a need for these type of notations. Let's take a break there, and then we'll come back with part 2B of our study in the Gospel of John.